I'm David Jones, and for the last 3 decades, I've been researching how humans cooperate to get work done. In my research, I have documented a pattern, a recurring strange attractor in the complex adaptive systems that arise when we cooperate toward a purpose. In the previous 4 videos, I've outlined that discovery. In this presentation, I draw attention to some other published findings that support my observations. Humans make by speaking. This series of presentations introduces the strange attractor that is common to all human making by speaking. This MBS attractor was discovered by David Jones during studies that commenced in 1990 and is now being researched and commercialised by Dylan Jones and David Jones. In the earlier videos in this series, I've made the claim that knowledge development takes the form of making by speaking, and that a strange attractor common to all our making by speaking reveals itself through ecosystems of conversational activity and artifacts. The conversational ecosystems are thus evidenced by recurring socio-material clusters of actions and artifacts. There is a connection between the attractor and the resultant ways we think, act, lead, and organise. And in fact, that's how I identified the attractor over the 25 years of research into knowledge development processes. But how would we validate such a finding? During the Cold War, an American submarine grounded on the ocean floor close to the Azores. A multidisciplinary team from engineers to oceanographers stated where they thought the submarine might lie. Each searched using presuppositions from their field. The group averaged the result. The average was within 6 metres of the submarine. The story might not be exactly right in the way that it's told here, but it provides a succinct illustration of the kind of proof we must seek when we are talking about non-repeatable events. Consilience is the process used by historians and archaeologists, a process where proof is derived through a convergence of evidence from numerous lines of inquiry, multiple independent inductions, all of which point to an unmistakable conclusion. The events of a complex adaptive system are by definition non-repeatable. To argue further for the discovery of the MBS attractor, we must look for consilient patterns. If this phenomenon is real, then of course it will reveal itself in many other places where people observe, think, and write about human cooperation, even though they begin from completely different research programs or from none at all. In this video, I offer evidence from numerous lines of inquiry, multiple independent inductions, and I do that in 3 layers. What I can say here about every layer will be necessarily brief, but it will provide some signposts. The 3 layers are micro, from the level of conversation analysis, meso at the level of the recurring pattern, and macro at the level of our social and philosophical patterns of interaction. We cannot overestimate the boldness and ramifications of the claim that there is a strange attractor in our conversational interactions when we participate toward purpose. But if this is to be a credible explanation of our participations, it must also explain our coordinations, because those are where the fine-grained work of an ongoing alignment is negotiated. And indeed, the making by speaking attractor shows up in fine detail at the level of conversations and conversational analysis, and increasingly in multimodal coordination studies. In the last video, we saw that the attractor shows up in narratology, and it is revealed in schemas that string speech acts together. At this micro level, the fractality of the question answering complex is found all the way down to our moment by moment navigations in conversational adjacency pairs. For consilience for the MBS Attractor, we could look again at some fine detail revealed by conversation researchers. Stephen Levinson is a conversation analyst who has advanced the work of Harvey Sachs on turn-taking in conversation. His examples reveal that Collingwood's question-answer complex is an everyday reality at the level of how we actually talk. Adjacency pairs that have a question-answering structure readily arrive at 3 or 4 recursions in transactional contexts. And at this fine-grained level, it is the question and answer as question and answer in their most recognisable grammatical forms that show up. Recall that we looked at this example from Levinson's work when we were looking at the nature of questions. This way that a question answering complex has recursions until the answer that fits the opening question is arrived at is called centre embedding. What Levinson concludes about the record of such dialogues is important. He concludes that centre embedding is a core part of the human interaction system. In fact, he says that it's much more highly restricted in syntax, the kind of work he's showing here, than it is in other aspects of cognition. The more Levinson is able to push the boundaries of observing recursions, the more the features of a QA complex become apparent. At the second level of our consilience, the meso level of seeing the making by speaking attractor pattern repeated in many human endeavours, it shows up in schemas. In 2020, Kendrick and colleagues offered this visual summary of the recursive patterns observed by Levinson as he made further developments of Harvey Sachs' turn-taking studies. It's not difficult to see the phases in their model in terms of the making by speaking attractor. Pre-question, where the interaction begins and the issue is posed. Question answering, where the interaction proceeds and a resolution is sought. Post-answer, where the interaction concludes with a delivery on the resolution. I dwell on this because for many of us, the idea that there are these kinds of hidden patterns in our language is still somewhat novel. And one of the points of resistance I frequently encounter in explaining my discovery is disbelief that my model could extend beyond English. Having seen their level of phenomenon of sequence organisation turning up in 12 different languages, Kendrick and colleagues were happy to call it a universal infrastructure for social action. Nancy Cook, Jamie Gorman, and a range of colleagues studied how we think together in cooperative tasks. They contributed to a very important pivot in theorising cognition, away from individuals and away from teams as collections of individuals. They demonstrated that team cognition was an emergent property of the interactions between team members. Team cognition is an activity, not a property or product. Team cognition is inextricably tied to context. And team cognition is best measured and studied when the team is the unit of analysis. Specifically, Cook and colleagues had a simulator laboratory where they studied interactions involved in military operations, looking at team coordination dynamics. Here's a schematic transcript of a team in action that they reported. And this is the coding system they developed from what they observed. Again, this is how it would map onto our framework. In 2009, Nancy Cook reported on work done by Arizona State University and cognitive reengineering research on interactive team cognition. Part of the report included visualization of a transcript where military personnel in a synthetic task environment were coordinating the evacuation of a hostage. She showed the analysis of that transcript in a linear form, but also diagrammed it by nesting their S, N, and C cycles. In this diagram, I translate Cook's visual into the terms of the requisite conversations framework, and we can readily see the recursions nested in the conversation transcript. Of course, without the attractor pattern being discerned, all we see is the complexity. Even if we categorise the nature of the individual exchanges, their occurrence has no discernible pattern. As we move to a macro view, the fractal character of the attractor continues to scale. As a socially conditioned and conditioning structure, it shows up when practitioners and researchers use grounded methods to pattern social phenomena. It remains discernible in the conversational architectures of large-scale human enterprise, both of those that are knowledge-based, even philosophical, and those that are material, such as engineering. I try here to stick to examples that have an empirical, observational base, although it is surprising how often the pattern turns up in purely theoretical frames. A series of case studies of business model innovations that either succeeded or failed in delivering value to customers found that effectiveness in business model innovation hinges on the three process phases that unfold in collaboration with the customers: value proposition definition, value provision design, and value in use delivery. In 1987, Daniel Dennett proposed a hierarchical model of explanation of our attempts to answer the question of why things are. And he did that based on three different stances. He points out that we begin with the physical stance, the ground floor stance, i.e. the methods of science, and especially the physical material methods. We then move for more complex entities to trying to make sense of them from a slightly elevated design perspective and ask what are the general principles governing the design of any system that might carry out those tasks successfully. And eventually, with increasing complexity, we move to the intentional stance, where the system is treated for explanatory purpose as if it were a rational thinking agent attempting to carry out a particular task successfully. Some of the emergent features of the making by speaking attractor, when we are question answering at scale, have significant implications for ontology. Understanding what drives the distribution of social phenomena at different levels of organisation allows us to integrate what otherwise always seem to crop up as binaries and polarising choices. Boisseau and McKelvey drew on the phenomenon of power law distributed phenomena that is associated with this and created a single overarching framework to integrate the different ontological assumptions between the order-seeking regime of the modernists and the richness-seeking regime of the postmodernists. In their Academy of Management Review article, Boisseau and McKelvey claim that this frame permits a better understanding of behaviours. As they say, no natural boundaries separate the three regimes. They interpenetrate. Yet the first is the natural home of the historian, the second of social scientists and biologists, and the third of scientists who study non-living phenomena. Their model also entails ecosystems of conversation, quote, since effective representations in each regime will call for a different mix of narrative and abstract symbolic resources, unquote. In a study across the USA of 30 founders of major companies, Saraswati asked, what makes entrepreneurs entrepreneurial? Clearly a question relevant to knowledge development. Her protocol analysis of interviews distinguished three forms of reasoning, illustrated in her paper: managerial thinking with causal reasoning, strategic thinking with creative causal reasoning, and entrepreneurial thinking with effectual reasoning. Entrepreneurs are distinguished by being able to lead conversations that innovate the goal itself. Strategy accepts the context of a given goal and innovates the means to achieve it. Managers accept the goal and means and use their conversational interactions to deliver in an unfolding environment. Nick Hobecker speaks of three recursions of work systems: the work system level, a second recursion, and a third recursion. He calls the first of these the added value domain, where a set of relatively homogeneous requirements, specifications, of a group of clients are transformed into those requirements being met, so that the clients, owners, and actors can appreciate the relevance of the work system. The innovation domain, where changes in values in the environment are sensed and transformed into new products, services, and processes. This work system is involved in the discovery and creation of the added value of the future. And the value systems domain is involved in the permanent creation of the elements of a new culture by creating new languages and new descriptions and prescriptions about the world through a permanent debate between the carriers of different worldviews, traditions, and cultures. I could go on. Edgar Schein's three cultures, complexity leadership theory, the Nobel Prize-winning Ostrom's rule taxonomies, the classic cognition of abstraction laddering, the independently verified message design logics. So that is a whirlwind survey of the consilient proofs of this phenomenon. At every level, this fractal question-answering architecture has been both revealed and obscured by analytical effort, and often missed entirely due to an absence of sufficiently heuristic view, unable to see the wood for the trees. Furthermore, the choice of descriptors is sometimes unsympathetic with my purpose, as when Kuren refers to the multivocal negotiating of scope as manipulation. And the language sometimes reflects the culture of its era, as when Edgar Schein characterises all generative activity in organisations as belonging to an engineering culture. But as any historian will tell you, these variations actually bring the ring of truth. And so to our conclusion. Knowledge development takes the form of making by speaking. There is repeated evidence for the making by speaking attractor and its system framework in a wide array of academic and practitioner models. We're very keen to discuss how this insight could further your research or application arena.